Hello, my name is Steve Hunnisett and welcome to this talk on the fire services in the City of London, Churchill's Heroes with Grimy Faces. I was originally meant to be giving this talk live at the Guildhall, which I was looking forward to enormously, but obviously because of events I'm unable to do so, and so we thought that we'd upload a commentary onto the slideshow that I was going to use to accompany the talk. Before we carry on, I should explain who I am. My name is Steve Hunnisett. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and I've been doing this job full-time as a freelance guide since 2015. My original background comes from the Merchant Navy and the construction industry, and I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in the city during my work, both in the shipping industry and subsequently in construction. And it's really nice for me today to guide walks around the City of London and other parts as well, where we can examine our wartime history. As we're not able to be at the Guildhall, I thought it would be of interest to include a photograph of the Guildhall on the morning of the 30th of December 1940, which was the morning after the raid that became known as the Second Great Fire of London. It was a concerted effort by the Luftwaffe to paralyse London's financial and commercial district, and as you can see from the photograph, the Guildhall was one of the victims. As we'll see in this talk, there were huge areas of the City of London that were affected in particular by this raid, and it was a night when the London Fire Brigade and the Auxiliary Fire Service really had their work cut out. But before we go any further, I think it's a good idea to talk a little bit about the history and the organisation of the Auxiliary Fire Service in particular. The Auxiliary Fire Service was formed in 1938. It was part of the general expansion of the Civil Defence Service, which at that time was known as the Air Raid Precautions or ARP Service. It was a direct response to events culminating in the Munich crisis in September of that year, and also very much with an eye on what was happening in Spain during the Civil War. Although the immediate threat of war passed with the signing of Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler at Munich, preparations continued, and as you can see from the poster, it was organised on a municipal basis. In London, it was under the auspices of the London County Council. But similar arrangements were put in place across the country, and this municipal administration of the fire service was at once its strength, but it was also to prove a weakness, which we'll examine later on in this talk. As we can see from this organisation chart, London was one of 12 civil defence regions, and it was the only city large enough in the country to warrant being described as a region in its own right. And to give you an idea, it roughly covered the Metropolitan and City of London police areas. The overall civil defence control for London was located in a purpose-built bunker at the front of the Geological Museum, which at that time was located at the junction of Cromwell Road and Exhibition Road, and it was ready for occupation in 1938. London was placed under the command of a Civil Defence Commissioner, Sir Ernest Gowers, and he had a Deputy Admiral Sir Edward Evans. London was further subdivided into groups of between 5 and 11 neighbouring councils, and it was placed under the overall command of one of them. As you can see from the chart, the City of London was in Group 3, and the borough control for the City of London was located at the Guildhall. with backup control centres at the City of London Police Headquarters, which at that time was in Old Jewry, and there was a further backup location in Upper Thames Street. As you can see here from this chain of command, the Civil Defence organisation was an incredibly complex setup, which, like many things in wartime, evolved with wartime experience. You can see that the fire service was just one of many links in the chain of the wider organisation, which covered everything from air raid wardens through the fire brigades and rescue services, right the way down to things such as public utilities and even mobile baths. On this map we can see the fire service coverage of the City of London up until the outbreak of war in 1939. There were 6 fire stations that covered the city, 2 that were just outside, Clerkenwell and Shoreditch, and 4 actually located within the square mile, Whitefriars, Cannon Street, Bishopsgate and Red Cross Street, which is very much now buried beneath the Barbican development, in case you were wondering exactly where Red Cross Street is located. As we can see though, upon the outbreak of war in September 1939, there was a huge increase in coverage as the AFS or Auxiliary Fire Service stations were commissioned. These were invariably located at schools. Of course, the pupils of those schools had been evacuated to the countryside, but sometimes these fire stations were also located at places such as taxi garages, at railway premises, basically anywhere that had accommodation for vehicles and also had accommodation that could be converted into mess rooms, offices and sleeping accommodation for the men. In this photograph we see a typical group of AFS firemen. The rank of firefighter is a modern invention, and so throughout this talk I will use the 1940 designations such as fireman and firewoman. So please don't think I'm being sexist, I'm just using the descriptions, the ranks that were in force at the time. You can see that they're standing in front of equipment that was very typical of the early war period. It's a requisitioned London taxi towing a trailer pump with a ladder on the roof rack. These particular group of men were based at Gordon Brock Road School in Brockley, but they are very typical of the AFS at the time. In 1940, a fireman's pay was £3.05 a week, so not particularly good money even by 1940 standards, although it did compare quite favourably with that of a British private soldier who received 2 and 6 per day at that time. The fire service was a volunteer organisation and a recruit was automatically exempted from being called up into the armed forces. And so there were a fair number of conscientious objectors who found themselves volunteering for service, as did many other members of the public who were perhaps too old to serve in the armed forces but were still in good shape and they wanted to help do their bit to defend their local neighbourhoods. The AFS also attracted many from the world of the arts and media, perhaps again as a way of helping to do their bit whilst not having to be in a position of having to take lives. The auxiliaries, though, were viewed with a certain amount of distaste by the regular fire brigade men, many of whom were ex-servicemen. At that time, the London Fire Brigade had a very large ex-Royal Navy presence, and some of these guys were, frankly, sexist towards the numbers of women that also joined the fire service. Sadly, then as now, there was also a certain amount of anti-Semitic behaviour around, And of course, the auxiliaries and the civil defence organisation as a whole tended to reflect the demographic of the areas that they were covering, because as we mentioned earlier, it was very much a locally organised organisation. The anti-Semitic behaviour was largely eradicated fairly quickly as the war progressed. But at the start of the war, during the phony war period, the auxiliaries were also given a hard time by the public. Whipped up, it has to be said, by certain elements of the media. The phony war was a period when, as far as the public were concerned, there wasn't actually that much going on. So you had insults such as £3 a week army dodgers, £3 a week to play darts. These were just some of the insults that were hurled the way of recruits that have found themselves in the auxiliary fire service. As I'm sure many of you will know, the first bomb on the City of London fell at Fore Street in Moorgate in the very early hours of the 25th of August 1940. Now, this particular bomb, as legend would have it, was dropped in error. This raid was reputedly caused by bombers ditching their bombs that had been intended for the Thames Haven oil refineries. I've always been a little bit dubious about that particular version of history, as the bombs that fell on that particular night or early morning were too widespread, and actually too many of them, I think, to have been an accidental raid. But it's one of those things in history that historians do tend to disagree about, but I've always been a little bit dubious about that particular version. In a way, though, it did spark the coming of the main Blitz, because as a direct result of these bombs dropping on the City of London and elsewhere in London, Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid by the Royal Air Force on Berlin, which actually took place on the night of the 25th of August. And although damage caused to the German capital was very minuscule in comparison with what was to come later, it did spark Hitler into diverting his attacks from British airfields and industrial targets into more widespread, what we would now call terror bombing of London and other British cities. What we now call the London Blitz, or the Night Blitz, started in earnest on the afternoon of Saturday the 7th of September 1940, a date that Londoners became to call Black Saturday. This particular raid didn't really affect the square mile, but as you can see from this photograph taken from London Bridge at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the fires in the East End and the Surrey docks could be seen quite clearly from London Bridge, and Londoners in the City of London at that time must have been in a way awestruck at seeing the scenes unfolding in front of them, and also quite worried as to what the future might hold. As we can see from these slides, the Blitz reached the City of London on the following night, on the 8th of September 1940. The bus passengers, you'll be pleased to hear, were safely taking shelter in Monument Station, and they came out unscathed. The night of the 14th of October, however, saw the first fireman killed in the City of London. 3 firemen were killed at Bonhill Street in EC2, and sadly another officer was killed in Throgmorton Street 2 nights later. As we've touched on earlier, the City of London's ordeal by fire came on the night of the 29th of December 1940. This was a concerted, well-planned attempt by the Luftwaffe to paralyse the financial centre of the country by fire. There was also another bonus factor as far as the Luftwaffe were concerned, and that was the fact that despite the country being at war, Many night watchmen and fire watchers were absent. People were celebrating Christmas week and they were looking forward to the New Year festivities. As a result of this raid, legislation was passed compelling companies to ensure that they had 24-hour fire watch coverage. But on this raid, fires were often allowed to start without being noticed until it was too late. In comparison with later RAF raids on German cities, this particular raid was quite a small affair. There were only about 140 bombers dispatched to London, and although they were originally intended to return to base, to rearm and fly a second wave, bad weather in France actually precluded that second wave of attacks. But the attack had been deliberately planned to coincide with an especially low tide on the Thames, as the Luftwaffe were fully aware that the fire brigade used water from the Thames to augment their emergency supplies. The all clear sounded just before midnight, but by this time over 1,500 fires had been started in the city. Many of these joined together to form vast conflagrations, as we can see from the next slide. Here we see the LCC bomb map that covers the City of London. Most of the black and purple areas that you see are those that were burned out or destroyed on the night of the 29th of December. At one stage during this raid, there were 2,000 pumps and some 6,000 firemen tackling the blazes, and many of these firemen had been mobilised from outside London, and they came from places as widespread as Woking, Wimbledon, Hendon, Uxbridge, West Ham and Woolwich, amongst other places. It was thought that some 24,000 incendiary bombs were dropped in this raid, but despite the huge fires and the huge areas that were damaged, because relatively few people lived in the City of London at that time, the death toll was relatively light. There were 160 people killed, including 13 firemen. 10 of those firemen were lost in the City of London, including one chap, Arthur Waterman, who lost his life here at the Guildhall. One particularly tragic event that was immortalised in a painting by the artist and wartime fireman Leonard Rosoman was an incident at Shoe Lane, just off Fleet Street by the Daily Express building. Leonard Rosoman was part of a squad from Station 13 at Belsize Park, and they were tackling a major fire on an industrial building. He was manning a hose, which firemen called and still do call branches. He was manning a branch with his friend William Sansom, who himself would become better known post-war as a novelist and travel writer, as well as another fireman, Sidney Alfred Holder. He was a 33-year-old married man from Hendon. On this occasion, they were also being assisted by two passers-by who were off-duty servicemen, a soldier and an airman. Rosoman was approached by a senior officer and was ordered to accompany him to an adjacent building to see if there was a suitable place there for them to direct their branches downwards onto the fire. They had just arrived at what looked like a suitable spot when the wall gave way with a tremendous crack and it engulfed the three remaining men. Sansom and the airman managed to escape, but Holder and the soldier were buried beneath some 15 feet of red-hot bricks and masonry. Rosoman was deeply traumatised, as you would imagine, by the event, and he produced several versions of this painting, which he actually just described as the falling wall. He was trying to perhaps get the events from his consciousness, and he found himself painting and repainting the image over and over again. The soldier, sadly, was never identified, but in 2011, the charity Firemen Remembered unveiled a plaque in Shoe Lane which commemorates the event. The next major raid to affect the City of London came on the 11th of January 1941, when sadly a further 5 firemen lost their lives, including 3 from Wembley, who again were acting as reinforcements. The most notorious incident of the night undoubtedly occurred at Bank Station, where a high explosive bomb fell in the roadway above the ticket hall. As it was early in the evening, many people who were using the station as an air raid shelter were using the toilet facilities in the ticket hall before they were heading down to the platforms for the night, and this was where most of the 56 deaths occurred. The blast also collapsed the escalators and blew some unfortunate individuals off the platform into the path of an approaching train, and on this occasion there was very little that the firemen could do, except, of course, assisting in the rescue work. And I thought, as we can't actually be here in the city to give this talk, I thought I'd show you a then and now comparison. Nothing really to report on that photograph other than, as you can see, that's the scene today, and it hasn't actually changed that much, other than, of course, the repairs to the road having been made. Air raids were no longer occurring every night as they were at the beginning of the Blitz, but the raids that did take place were growing in intensity when they did come. The raid that took place on the night of the 16th, 17th of April 1941 became known to Londoners simply as the Wednesday, and sadly a further 3 firemen were to lose their lives here in Cannon Street. As you can see, huge amounts of damage caused here. The firemen that would have been fighting the fires would have had no chance, being showered in huge amounts of rubble, as you can see here in this photograph. And again, as we're not in the City of London at the moment, I thought I'd give you a comparison shot which I took about a week before lockdown at great personal risk, standing in the middle of the road. But again, you can see the scene hasn't changed that much. The view is very much still the same. In this same raid, on the 16th, 17th of April 1941, St Paul's Cathedral was hit once again. 250 kilo bomb actually penetrated through the roof and the floor into the crypt before it exploded. There was another devastating raid on the 20th of April, which was actually held by the Luftwaffe to mark Hitler's 53rd birthday. That caused further damage in the city, and it became known to those that were there as the Saturday. Certain raids just went down in London folklore and were given names such as the Wednesday, the Saturday, the Second Great Fire of London, Black Saturday, and people just used it almost as a form of shorthand when they were speaking to each other. If that name was mentioned, people knew what they were talking about. Although Londoners weren't to know it, the night of the 10th, 11th of May 1941 proved to be the final raid of the night Blitz. It was also the heaviest raid of the entire war, with 505 Luftwaffe bombers sent across in 2 waves, dropping nearly 750 tons of high explosive bombs, plus thousands of incendiaries, on a night when once again over 2,000 fires were started across London. 1,400 civilians were killed across the capital on that particular night, including a further 2 firemen within the City of London. One of those killed here we see pictured was a chap by the name of Abraham Lewis. He was one of the many Jewish members of the fire service, and he lost his life when, horrifically, he was hit himself by an incendiary bomb and would no doubt have been turned into a human torch as a result. This occurred at Trinity House, and inside Trinity House today, again, we have another Fireman Remembered plaque that commemorates Fireman Lewis's work on that night. It was another night of tremendous fires which were fanned by a strong easterly wind. The situation was particularly bad in Queen Victoria Street, where the fires were advancing westwards towards the Royal College of Arms and, perhaps more importantly in the scheme of things, towards Faraday House, which at that time held the largest telephone exchange in the world. The firemen were unable to halt the fires from reaching and destroying Salvation Army headquarters at 100 Queen Victoria Street, but a determined stand by the firemen, coupled with a bit of good luck with the wind changing direction, ensured that both the College of Arms and Faraday House were saved. Acts of heroism weren't just limited to the firemen. On this particular night, a Salvation Army canteen van had set up outside their headquarters, and the occupants were keeping the firemen and other civil defence workers supplied with tea and refreshments. One fireman, George Woodhouse from Holloway, later recalled, "There were two Salvation Army lasses who were handing out cups of tea and biscuits as if it were a Sunday school outing. They appeared to be completely unaware of the bombs falling all around them. I often wondered what the word courage meant, but on that night, those two lasses had it in abundance." The final photograph in the sequence from the 10th, 11th of May is of number 23 Queen Victoria Street. It's quite a well-known photograph from the Cross and Tibbs collection of photographs, and I've included it merely to demonstrate how close the firemen regularly courted death or serious injury. You can see there's a group of firemen standing, manning the turntable ladder just beyond where the building is about to collapse. So this was an everyday occurrence for them. Following the events of the 10th, 11th of May 1941, there then followed a much needed lull as German forces prepared for the invasion of the Soviet Union. And although Luftflotte 3, which had undertaken the majority of the air attacks against London, remained in France, Hitler had decreed that attacks on Great Britain would be held in abeyance until after he had defeated Soviet Russia. During this time, there was a fundamental reorganisation of the fire brigades in Great Britain. The Blitz had shown the weaknesses in having multiple fire brigades under municipal control. There were different methods of training that had been highlighted from one regional brigade to another. There were differences in equipment and training. And more importantly, there had been confusion over command when provincial fire brigades worked in London or vice versa. So on the 18th of August 1941, all of the municipal fire brigades in Great Britain were nationalised and became known as the National Fire Service. This created a unified fire service very much based on the model of the London Fire Brigade, and it was placed under the overall control of Sir Aylmer Firebrace, who was Chief Officer of the London Fire Brigade. London Fire Brigade methods of training, drill, equipment, and most importantly command were established across the country, and the new National Fire Service eagerly took stock during the welcome lull in bombing to train and reorganise for what was expected to be a new onslaught, which fortunately wasn't to come until late 1943. Although there were some desultory raids in late 1943, early 44, which Londoners somewhat dismissively called the Little Blitz, these were relatively minor affairs and they didn't cause too much inconvenience to the residents and workers of the square mile. The next real threat came from the Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons, the first of which were the V1s, which Londoners called Doodlebugs or buzz bombs. And although several of these did reach the city, casualties here were relatively light, as most of these weapons fell south of the River Thames. One V1 that did reach the city on the very first day of attacks, 13th of June 1944, destroyed College Hill House, which we see here on Upper Thames Street. But because of the very early hour of the attack, just after midnight, the office was empty and there were no casualties incurred. Fortunately, as far as the firefighters were concerned, Doodlebugs were high explosive devices and large fires resulting from them were quite rare, leaving them with very little actual firefighting associated with these incidents. Countermeasures against the V1s ensured that of the 9,231 launched against London, fewer than 2,500 actually reached their target. The final V weapon thrown against Londoners was one against which there was simply no defence, as the V2 rocket was effectively a ballistic missile. It was fired from a mobile base in Holland, and they took just over 4 minutes to reach their target, having left the Earth's atmosphere in the meantime. Here we can see a photograph of one on display post-war in Trafalgar Square, and it gives you an idea of the scale of these things when you compare the size of the men standing at the base of the rocket. The worst such incident to affect the City of London came on the 8th of March 1945, when a V2 impacted on Smithfield Market. 110 people were killed here, including many women and children. A further 123 were seriously injured, with 243 more who were walking wounded who could be treated at first aid posts. Many of the casualties were taken to Bart's Hospital, where 4 surgical teams worked full stretch for 24 hours in an attempt to clear the backlog of casualties. Many others were sent to the Royal Free, to UCH and Great Ormond Street, as Barts became simply overwhelmed with the sheer numbers of injured. Fortunately, as far as the firemen were concerned, fires were usually limited to the point of impact, leaving them free to concentrate on rescue and recovery work. Following Germany's surrender on the 8th of May 1945, there was only the aftermath to survey and the work of rebuilding to contemplate. As we can see from these 2 photographs, vast areas of the City of London have been left effectively as a blank canvas for developers to work with. The City of London had been changed forever by the bombing, and indeed in many places the geography was to completely change, with street names disappearing, damaged areas being swallowed up by new developments, most notably the Barbican development. On this slide, I've tried to provide a bit of a then and now comparison between the Fore Street of 1945 and a more recent view just taken a few days before lockdown started. As you can see, it's virtually impossible to provide an accurate then and now, and the only constant in the 2 photographs is the tower of St Giles Cripplegate, which in the modern view is just peering above the more recent Barbican development. Towards the end of 1945, Cyril Deman, divisional officer at Clerkenwell Fire Station, was given the task of conducting a senior officer of the Hamburg Fire Department around the worst damaged areas of the city. After they had surveyed the wastelands around St Paul's Cathedral and the wilderness of the Barbican, the Hamburg official turned to Deman and asked, "Is this the worst?" Deman replied that there were many similar areas, but what he had been shown was as bad as anything in London, to which the German retorted, "But this is nothing." To add further perspective, something in the region of 30,000 Londoners were killed by enemy action during the Second World War. In Hamburg, some 42,000 people were killed over just 4 nights in July and August 1943, the majority of those in one raid. It's thought that the Luftwaffe dropped some 3 million incendiary bombs on the UK during the Second World War. The RAF dropped 80 million on Germany. The final task that befell many wartime firemen was to attend many of the VE Day bonfires that have been lit in celebration of the victory over Germany. Some of these got out of control and the fire brigade had to be called to extinguish them, and for their trouble many were roundly booed. So much for the heroes with grimy faces. As we have seen, acts of heroism and bravery occurred on an almost nightly basis. Despite that, only one London fireman was awarded the George Cross, and although his story falls strictly outside the scope of this talk, it certainly merits mention. The award went to 30-year-old Harry Errington, one of many Jewish firefighters to serve, who was awarded his George Cross for extreme bravery in repeatedly returning inside a burning fire station in Rathbone Place, West 1, to rescue several of his colleagues who were trapped in the building. This was despite his initially being trapped himself and burning his hands in freeing himself. Harry was a master tailor by profession, which makes his actions even more selfless, considering that his hands were his livelihood. Harry happily survived the incident and made a full recovery to live until the age of 94. Many other firefighters received lesser awards, such as the George Medal, whilst many undoubted acts of bravery went unreported. Some 327 London firefighters, both men and women, lost their lives during the Second World War, and those names you see listed on the screen are those who died within the City of London. The Firefighters' Memorial opposite St Paul's Cathedral originally contained the names of the London firefighters who died, but it has subsequently been expanded to show all of those across the entire United Kingdom who lost their lives. In this final slide, we see a Defence Medal, which is effectively a campaign medal awarded to all members of the Civil Defence Services, as well as to service personnel who were deemed to be on non-operational duties in the United Kingdom. As with all British campaign medals, the ribbon tells a story and is not just a collection of random colours. The green represents the green and pleasant land of Great Britain, whereas the black stripes represent the black of the blackout, whereas the broad orange stripe represents fires lit by German bombs. I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I wish I could have given it to you in person. Maybe that opportunity will come again at some time in the future. But in the meantime, thanks for your time in listening to this presentation.